And I have to do a little change up here. Okay, so tonight we're going to be reviewing quiz 2. And to give you some reaction to quiz 1, I was very pleased with the grades on that quiz. One of the things that I'll be doing here probably next week is I'm going to be making some adjustments in that grade, meaning this. So if you got a 20 out of 20, you got 100% correct. And I'm going to convert that into 5 out of 5. Now, Blackboard's going to say 5 out of 20 or whatever, but just disregard that. And I'll explain that to you when I make that correction. The reason I do that is by the end, everything's going to add up to 100 points, and I don't have to convert and do all those kinds of things at the end of the course, although it can be a little bit of confusion, I suppose, for you students. I feel that you have a fairly good understanding of local revenue based on that quiz. And once again, I want to stress that I try to question you on the main topics. That's the key for this. And of course, realize that the local revenue will be a section or a part of your budget preparation project. And we'll be talking about that, of course, as the course unfolds. So at this point, do you have any questions about the course, the text, Blackboard layout, the quiz setup, or local revenue for schools? We're all good? Good. The one thing I'm sure you've already realized is that the text is written with all states in mind. And so therefore, there's information there that provides you background, if you will, from other states. Now, realizing that you just are in Michigan, I understand that. However, I want you to have a little bit of a grasp of how other states do things. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go through this tonight. And I know that, first of all, I realize that the syllabus must be a little bit of a mess. And my only explanation for that is I was hired one day and I had to have that syllabus back in about 24 hours. So I put it together fairly hastily. And so therefore, for example, on the syllabus, it says project 1 is due such and such soon here. It is not. It's not due until later. And the one thing I would suggest to you is follow the Blackboard process, because that will keep you on the mark, so to speak, with assignments and all those kinds of things. I was very happy that many of you watched the video that we had on YouTube in review of this chapter 1, or excuse me, quiz 1. And I also understand that within this arrangement with the class on Monday, you probably haven't even begun the study, if you will, for this information that looks at state revenue. And so I understand that, which means that when I've taught this and the students are like a day or two from the quiz, which at Franciscan, that's kind of where we were when we were able to have a meeting like this. I put a little more onus on the student providing information with regard to these objectives, as opposed to me providing that information. But I have no problem in providing that information. I'd like first to see if you understand it or know it and can provide that to me, and then we'll go from there. So the first, and all three of these modules focus on state revenue. And within this process, I always begin by giving you a backdrop as to how the state gets their funds in order to then distribute it to schools. And so that's what we have done. And of course, the first question, the first objective is to be able to identify and describe the state's top 2 general fund revenue or income sources. What would those be? Angela, you just told me that you just completed yours today.
Which Angela are you talking to?
You.
Oh, okay, I have this.
Cool.
It is, it's the general reserve would be the top 2 would be the personal income and the sales.
There you go. Bingo. And that's pretty consistent from state to state. Okay. Very, very consistent from state to state. Although a few states do not have income tax, a few states do not have sales tax, which is rather interesting, I guess. They just make it up in other ways. But yes, the state personal income tax is the largest provider of resources to the state, which then provides those funds for the kinds of services that they provide. So that's the next question. What are the top 2 expenditures for the state? Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
Education and welfare.
Well, and you're on point. The very first is social services. And with social services, we include welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, and those other services. And people often say, well, gee, that's kind of interesting because I thought that was federally funded. Well, it is in part. However, the states kick in a portion as well. And so therefore, that is the largest of the expenditures, social services. And it's called an inter-district governmental transfer. They're transferring that money from the federal government to the state government. The second is public K-12 education. And on average, students are surprised. They say, education is the number 2 expenditure for a state? The answer is yes. Other expenditures are just general government, higher education, that's state funded higher education, transportation, and law enforcement. So the money that comes through the sales tax and money that comes through the personal income tax goes into the general fund. The general fund can be used for any expenditure purpose, basically. And those resources are unrestricted. And this is a key concept that we want to make sure you understand. Unrestricted income. Can someone explain what unrestricted income means? What it means is that there's no restrictions, and there's no strings on it, so to speak. It can be spent however the state wants to spend it. As opposed to, for example, gasoline tax or fuel tax. Typically, fuel tax, and I haven't really checked Michigan, but this is pretty standard in most states. The gasoline tax is a restricted income, meaning that it may only be used for specific purposes. And typically the specific purposes are highway repair, building of highways, bridges, construction, things like that. So major concept there, restricted versus unrestricted. And we'll be pointing that out further or additionally. Of course, states approach budgeting via different vehicles. They use different ways in order to do that. And of course, in the meantime, the taxes, there are different types, these different types of taxes. And we want to have you to have a grasp of progressive tax. Can someone tell me what a progressive tax? And we got into this a little bit in your last quiz, a progressive tax. Well, a progressive tax is one that is thought to be progressive in that if you make less money, you pay less taxes. If you make more money, you pay more taxes. Therefore, the personal income tax would be a progressive tax. That is opposed to a proportional tax. And a proportional tax is where the same rate is placed on all individuals, regardless of their income. And of course, back to gas tax. Gas tax would be a proportional tax because that rate is the same if you are a zillionaire or if you do not have funds. So therefore, it's the same proportion. Then you get regressive taxes, and also they're called sin taxes. And regressive taxes and sin taxes are those taxes where typically a poorer individual pays a significantly higher portion or proportion of their income to pay for this tax. And so the examples are tobacco, tax on tobacco, tax on gambling, tax on other kinds of things is regressive. Now, the reason we want you to have a grasp of this is because states use various formulas to figure out which ones of these taxes do they want to impose on their residents. And so they have an understanding that regressive is just that, although that typically, and on average, the regressive taxes are the ones that get increased. Now, there in Michigan, of course, you guys already figured it out, that when they did away with the local property tax for the principal residents, they increased sales tax. And so they made up the money basically in that fashion. And so that is how that would work. Okay, so the next point we make with the state budgeting is do I have something showing there, or are we okay? So, hang on for a second. I gotta change my mouse for a moment to get rid of something. Okay. So the next point with state budgeting is there are two different types of budgets. Does anyone recall what those two different types of budgets are? Once again, I do understand where you guys are with the study of this material, and so I understand that I'll be giving much of this information. So there are two different types of budgets that legislators deal with. The first one is called the operating budget. Now, the operating budget is just that. It provides funds for those items like education and various operating expenses, as opposed to the capital budget. The capital budget is a budget that is for fixed items, buildings for universities, hospitals, and schools, PK through 12 schools. Often there is a way in which the state provides funding to a school district to gather those monies. Now, in Michigan, it is an annual budget. So that means legislators are every time or every year, they are considering a new budget for the fiscal year. Another term you need to be aware of. So there's a process that they go through in order to arrive at the amount of money that they're going to spend for operating. And it's a separate process to determine how much money they're going to spend for capital expenses. So two different budgets. The one that's the most important and the one you hear the most about in the news is the operating budget. And once again, in Michigan, these budgets are determined annually. Okay, they're determined annually. So that right there gives you the two different types of budgets that the state will have. And so now the next objective, we want you to be able to briefly describe the operating budget process in general terms. Can anyone provide that information?
Can I take a stab at it?
Sure.
Okay, so first they send a request to the different agencies, the different departments, and ask how much money they think that they will spend in the future, what additional projects they'll want to do.
Yes.
And then that is sent to the governor for recommendations where they make their budget based on what they get, and they decide where they want to confirm the funding, where they want to cut the funding. Then they submit the budget, and that goes to the House and the Senate for the appropriation stage,
Yep.
where each one submits their own bill of, yes, we agree with this, no, we want to change this. And then that is reconciled between the two houses for a final submission and sent to the governor. The governor then can review it, veto it, approve it. Then it goes, if it's vetoed, it's sent back to the budget to determine if they can override it, and then it's implemented.
Bingo. You had all the steps right on point. The one thing that people need to realize is the governor really isn't doing this work. The Office of Budget and Management is doing this work, and they are the ones that are receiving those requests from the various departments. And yes, the departments are requesting certain monies for certain kinds of objectives or certain things they want to accomplish. And then through the governor's office, the decisions are made as to what's priority, what's not priority, what we want to spend money on, what we do not want to spend money on. And that's when the governor's proposal goes to the legislature. So very, very good. And you're going to find that this process is the exact same process that the federal government uses. And so we're very entrenched into this particular process. The one thing I don't know about Michigan, some states have line item veto with the budget, meaning that the budget that is presented to the governor from the legislature can look at a particular line item and say, no, we are not going to fund this particular line item. And some states have that. Other states have the entire budget has to be approved or not. Here's what's very important. Very important for states is states may not spend more money than they have as income, unlike the federal government. So governors have to have a balanced budget. They have to have a balanced budget. And that budget that is submitted or signed must be signed prior to the start of a fiscal year. And of course, in Michigan, the start of the fiscal year is, when is the start of the fiscal year? Now, this is something, well, we're hitting key points, but this is something that you just got to know. October 1st is the start of your fiscal year for schools, for the state government. And the one thing that you won't know, but I'll share this with you now, the budget is not the bill that actually you can spend money from. That budget bill must be turned into what is called an appropriation. And the appropriation actually is what allows individuals or school districts as well as states to spend money. And typically the budget and the appropriations are very similar in nature. Okay, so we're going to get into the formula a little bit. Now, first of all, as you hopefully have, or you're going to find out if you haven't gotten to this point yet in Module 6, you will find out that first of all, Michigan uses a foundation program, foundation formula. And by the way, the text is wrong in what it says about Michigan's funding program. The source that I used for that was inaccurate. And I was quite astonished when I started doing my review, and I went, holy crap, that's wrong. So when I do a revisionist text, I gotta get that straight. So anyway, they have a formula, and it is a foundation formula. And there's no way you're gonna know all the variables within that formula. I don't expect you to know the variables of that formula. Fortunately, state departments of education have computers that have all those formulas built in, and they plug the input, they input the variables and spit out the amount of money that a school district is going to receive. But there are some key parts to that formula that I want you to be aware of. In most states, and Michigan is the same, the formula begins with student enrollment. And that is true in your state, as well as Ohio and many, many other states that use foundation program. The terminology can be a little bit different. You call it state aid membership, okay? In Ohio, it's called the FTE, full-time equivalent student, okay? And then the next variable that starts that formula is special education enrollment. And this was one of the things that I was a little bit surprised by, if you will, as I was analyzing that formula. Michigan only funds two categories of special education students, Section 52 and Section 53. Now, I don't know, can someone tell me the difference? My guess is Section 52 are probably the less handicapped children, special education children, and probably 53 is probably the more involved student. Is that correct? Does anyone know that or that would be my guess. That's just my gut feeling. And this is part of what I want you to be aware of, particularly if you are ever in a position to be able to need to argue, if you will, for more funding, if that comes to play. Two categories is minimal, quite frankly. I mean, the number of special education categories, I used to know it off the top of my head, but can't remember now, probably 10, 12 different categories, some being more involved as far as expenses are concerned than others. And so consequently, an autistic child is a very expensive child to educate. However, Michigan doesn't acknowledge that. And therefore, they are not providing funding for that. Therefore, and by law, federal law, you have to provide that service, period. And so therefore, local school districts are caught with picking up the tab, if you will, for those additional funds. And so consequently, that's some of the reasons I want you to make sure that you understand that. Okay, so that begins the process. There's also going to be a trigger point as to how much money the state is expected to give for each student. I think it was $9,100 and some dollars in that vicinity. That's what was appropriated for PK through public education, okay? And so after you go through all these variables, the foundation program then attempts to equalize the money that a wealthy school district gets and a poorer school district gets. And that's where the local revenue per membership comes into play. And last week we had you figure some problems based on that. We asked you which school district was wealthier than was District A, more wealthier than B, and you figured that out because you just take the aggregate valuation of and in your state, the non-homestead properties and commercial properties, and you arrive at the wealth of the school district. So that variable gets put into the formula to equalize. And by the way, state basic aid is intended to equalize funding from school A to school B, okay? And they've come up with a variety of ways to do that. So that's why that particular concept local revenue per membership was so important, okay? So basically, that's the formula. We take the pupils, you multiply it by the target amount. It was $9,150, by the way. I got it here in my notes. And then you take away the local non-homestead and commercial property tax revenue. And that arrives at the amount of money that you're going to receive. And of course, you divide that by the number of students you have, and there you come up with the student amount that's received. So that's basically what we want you to be aware of, is those basic variables. And of course, in the meantime, there are a number of other ways that states fund schools. They use full funding, and that's Hawaii, strange setup there. Then there is flat grant, that's North Carolina, the only state that uses that, and that's a very simple one to understand. Foundation is the most popular, and then there's power equalization. And power equalization, talk about a very convoluted equation. Those are convoluted equations. And so therefore, what they arrive at is, once again, trying to get to the equalizing of this basic aid. And so that's the part of that. So in general, that's what we want for public understanding of the state basic aid. Now, for Catholic students, and as Kathleen was here for a minute, of course, what I find interesting is all of you but one work in a Catholic school, but you are in a public program, except Kathleen. And so therefore, I take it that you want to be, and I understand that the leadership part of that and those kinds of things. So, the chances, well, I won't go there. Anyway, obviously, we are well aware that Michigan, through a couple of legal cases, blocked funding, state funding for Catholic schools. However, there are 4 incidents that Catholic schools do receive state funding for. And the first one is in transportation. And although you don't receive money per se, you're not spending money to transport the children to your school. The public school picks up that cost. And so therefore, that's the way that works, okay? Michigan testing program. If you are involved as a Catholic school, if you're involved in the Michigan testing program, that program is paid for you. The one that was kind of interesting to me was the educational media centers. Now, I don't know what's happening there in Michigan, but of course, here we're talking about what's your county, I can't remember the name of the county organization that does most of the special education work. What's that?
Is it Wayne County?
Yeah, yes, RISA. Yeah, I think that would be the appropriate term. Anyway, oftentimes those services come through RISA, the Educational Media Center. For example, if they are providing a workshop for teachers on something to do with technology, parochial schools should be invited. Parochial schools should be, or staff should be allowed to attend those. So that was kind of interesting. This is key for you Catholic individuals that work in Catholic schools. Auxiliary services. Now, what was interesting is according to Michigan Administrative Code R340.293, auxiliary services are for to provide things such as remedial reading, if there would be eye exams, for example, things such as this, the state provides funding for that, or the services for that. to non-public or private schools. So therefore, you're going to want to keep an eye on that one, because if a public school decides to offer an auxiliary service, they are required by this law to notify the Catholic school within 30 days that they are providing this service. Now, oftentimes, the public school personnel administration doesn't know this, and oftentimes the Catholic school people don't know this, and so it gets lost in the shuffle, so to speak. There are, of course, the two other programs that other states use to provide services for Catholic schools, public state funding, and that's the voucher program and tax credit scholarships, and we talked a little bit about that. So the other elements of the Michigan Foundation program that I found rather revealing and rather interesting, of course, the first one I already mentioned, and that was Michigan, the state of Michigan provides funding for only 2 weights of special education students. And many, many other states provide 6, 7 other weights based on the need for that student's services. And once again, we know that an autistic child needs more involved services than does a speech-only child. And so therefore, that was the case. Another reveal that I found was that Michigan, state of Michigan, grants no funding for gifted students. Once again, many states provide additional funding for gifted students. And it's either built into the formula, like it is in Ohio, or it is a categorically funded program. That gets me into the next category. Define categorical aid and classify the categories for schools. And by the way, I know we don't have any charter school students here, but charter schools are funded in Michigan very nicely, quite frankly, and they are funded in the same manner, similar manner, as is the public schools. And in some places across the country, and you need to hear this, some places across the country, Catholic schools are choosing to become charter schools. Now, they can still provide the same services, they can still do the same thing, but what that has done for them is that opens up the door for state resources. And so that's being done in some places. Okay, so now it's back to categorical funding. Can someone explain categorical funding? Okay, categorical funding means that it is not built within the state formula. It is separately funded, meaning that the legislators decide how much money they're going to spend in this particular category. And across the country, some of those categories are special education. Some of those categories are transportation, gifted students. Those are oftentimes separate. In Michigan, transportation is the only other categorically funded program, meaning that, and if it's done like it is in Ohio, we provide the miles that we are driving, we provide the type of roads we're driving on, and we submit that to the state. The state uses their formula, and they arrive at how much money we're going to receive categorically. And so therefore, it is a separate amount of money. And it is restricted, meaning that it can only be used for transportation of students, okay? That's why that's so important. So now we get into another set of state funds, and that would be entitlement grants and discretionary grants. Have any of you got to that point yet to understand entitlement grants and discretionary or competitive grants? Okay, in Michigan, at this point, there are two entitlement grants. Now, an entitlement means that all school districts are entitled to these funds. Typically, there might be an application, there might be a formula to decide exactly how much they are going to receive. Oftentimes it is by the number of students that you have in the school, but according to my review, Catholic schools are eligible for Kids Back on Track grant entitlement, that's an entitlement, and assessment digital literacy preparation programs. That is an entitlement program. Therefore, if your school is not receiving those monies, you ought to be, or someone in the school ought to be asking questions to find out how they need to apply for that. So once again, I'm fairly certain that parochial schools are eligible for those entitlement funds. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain. I dug as deep as I could dig to find out, and I think that that is possible. Okay, so the next set of money that a state sets aside for schools are called discretionary grants. Discretionary means competitive. Competitive meaning that you apply for the grant through a process. And by the way, in this course, you're going to be working on grant writing and grant development. And so I discovered two different competitive grants that schools in Michigan can currently apply for if the application process isn't complete for this year. And that is called an additional instructional time, that's the grant, and robotics, that's another grant. Now, oftentimes, some of these funds come from some other department other than the Department of Education. And you'll find out particularly in federal revenue, how that works. So basically, let's go back for a minute about special education. You know, for Catholic schools, students who are identified as special education are given the same services as public school students. Therefore, and probably the special education, well, let me ask you this. Do you have special education teachers in your schools, or do they come from the public school to your school? Right, Kathleen?
Yeah, they come from, for us, it's Redford Union and South Redford.
Yes. And so, and of course, the way that works is obviously those two school districts are, you receive students from in those two districts. Therefore, you have two different districts that are providing those services, but they equally have to provide those services. And of course, in the meantime, the process of identification and all that falls upon the public school district. And once again, there has to be a conversation about those funds coming available. Okay. And so, you know, to put this in perspective, so state funding for schools comes in 3 or 4 different, I call them buckets, okay, buckets of money. The first biggest bucket is the state basic aid program. And of course, that's for public schools only, okay? The next bucket is through categorical funding. And in Michigan, transportation comes through categorical funding. The state sets aside a specific amount of money for that expense, and schools submit applications or provide information to receive their share of those monies. Okay, and of course, then you get to the entitlement grants. And once again, entitlement means that the state legislature decide. So Yeah, let's go back to that one for a minute. Kids back on track. I'm going to guess that we went through the pandemic. People were complaining that kids were not on target like they should have been. And that was consistent not only in Michigan, that was consistent across the country. And so therefore, the state legislature said, how are we going to correct this? How are we going to make this right? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to allocate set number of dollars specifically for getting kids back on track. And so that is probably the backdrop of how that one came about, okay? I don't know for sure, but my guess is, and by the way, entitlements come and go. Once again, with an annual determination of the budget in Michigan, these entitlements and discretionary grants could be just 1 year and gone, one and gone, so to speak. Sometimes they are extended or continued on. And so the last one is discretionary grants. Once again, one of the things I would urge you to do is become very familiar with the Michigan Department of Education website, particularly their financial section, because all of this information is contained in there. And so keeping track of that kind of information that's a good way to do that, okay? So, of course, we've already made the point that terminology is extraordinarily important. And so therefore, I just want to kind of review the most important terms. Now, all the terms are important. However, these are the most important terms. We talked about restricted versus unrestricted revenue. And of course, understanding that restricted means that it can only be spent for a specific purpose. And gas tax is an example of that. Unrestricted, meaning that the resources, the income from personal income tax, as well as sales tax, general sales tax, that is unrestricted, can be used for any purpose. And so therefore, that's where the funding primarily comes for education. Another term that many schools, many formulas include is what is called a hold harmless agreement. Michigan has a hold harmless agreement. What this agreement says is that if circumstances changed, we are not going to drop your revenue from the state dramatically. We're going to keep it the same. And where this came into play was when Proposal A came into being, that was going to dramatically change the money that schools were going to be receiving in some instances. Now, in many instances, they increased their funds, but they have a hold harmless agreement, meaning that they're not going to hold people harmless if those circumstances change. So that's an important recognition. Also, unrestricted. So with basic aid, state basic aid, that's what that's called, basic aid, that's the formula. It's Michigan's formula allowance. That is also called grants in aid, unrestricted grants in aid. So in general, it's considered to be a grant, although it is really more of an entitlement, if you want my honest opinion about it. But so therefore, you'll see that terminology, that annual operating budget. Once again, the state has two budgets, an operating budget and a capital budget. Every year, legislators decide how much money they're going to put into both of those buckets. And so therefore, the operating budget is for day-to-day expenses, and it's the general fund, as opposed to the capital budget, which is strictly to build buildings, universities, hospitals, schools, public state buildings, okay? And finally, fiscal year. Extraordinarily important concept. You have to understand that Michigan's fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30, and the state operates that way as well. Therefore, the state government must have in place by October 1st their budget. And there's not going to be an instance where they don't. Quite frankly, politics go out the window. It has to happen. Services stop. You know, unlike the federal government, where they don't have to have a balanced budget, and they just pass an extension and keep kicking the can down the road, as far as I'm concerned. So with that, gives you a basic understanding of state funding, and also a fair understanding of state funding for parochial, non-public private schools. So with that, questions? So this quiz will open in modular 8, okay? And it will open on Friday, or excuse me, on Monday, February 19th, 1 week from today, and it'll open from 5 till 8, just like the last time. This quiz has 4 multiple choice questions, 6 true false questions, and 1 short answer questions. So basically, those are the format that I use for questioning. And oftentimes there's an upload of a document that you have to prepare in advance. But this time there's no document to upload. However, there will be 1 short answer question, which you'll be given 4 or 5 lines to explain what it is we were asking you to explain. Okay. Well, we did pretty good on time. We're under an hour, and that's usually what I try to shoot for with these. So
I have a quick question.
yes, feel free
This
to.
might only affect me, it might not. My school is on winter break next week, like I was
Okay.
telling you.
Okay.
Madonna is not.
Yes.
I am going to be gone on vacation, so I'm happy to do the quiz, but I'm a little nervous about the specific time frame, because if we're
Okay. Yeah.
like, I don't want to change 10 people's plans to
No.
be on a
You
computer for
don't
an
have
hour.
to. You don't have to. So, once again, the content here in general is self-paced, meaning that
Right.
you can get ahead of content. You don't want to get too far behind in content. So therefore, no worries. If you get a few things done prior to, and by the way, I think you've started to realize that I bring you through specific activities in a progression. And that progression is to provide you background to learn the next concept generally, and overall to understand the total concept. So in answering your question, no problem. I'm glad that you're able to take the quiz at the time that it's offered. But you will just either be a little bit behind, or you'll want to get ahead. The bottom line is, before you take that quiz, you have to be through the activities of modulars 4.
No, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't know if I'll be able to sign on to take the quiz exactly at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
That's what I'm nervous about. I'm not nervous about getting the content done. I'm nervous about being able to drop what a group of 10 people are doing to get to a computer at 5 o'clock to do it.
Okay. So if there's ever any conflict, well, first of all, if you can do that, that's wonderful. If not, shoot me a text, or shoot me an email, explain your circumstance, and we will figure out some alternative. Okay.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
So just so you know, I've had students who the quiz was like for Monday, and gee, they had a board meeting that they were required to be in. And they said, Doc, I want to be there, but I just cannot be there. And I'm not sure how long this board meeting is going to go. And so it'll probably be closed. But I said, hey, we'll figure it out. We'll get it figured out. So it's not a problem. We'll figure it out. So if you aren't able to take it at that time, shoot me a text, shoot me an email, explain, and we'll figure out an alternative. Okay?
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
No worries. Other questions? Well, keep digging. You know, I know that this content is all fresh to you, but darn, you know, I just can't tell you how important it is. You know, for you to have an understanding of how schools are funded, puts you in a position to be able to influence the quality of education you provide students if you are in a leadership position. And so therefore, that's why I think it's so darned important for individuals to have an understanding of these concepts. Okay? And once again, I will have this posted on YouTube. I'll send you the link. And you know, the good thing for me, like I was maybe saying before, is in past, my students were about 1 or 2 days from taking the quiz. So therefore they were started to be schooled up, I guess, basically on the content. And so therefore I rested on them telling me what they knew. But I understand that the logistics of where we are here isn't the same. You have the modular closing or information being done by a Friday, this coming Friday, and next week you take the quiz. So I'm glad that we have that opportunity, that you've taken advantage of the opportunity to review this material on YouTube, because I think that will be quite helpful to you in the long run. Okay? With that, have a good evening. We'll see you in a few weeks. We'll be talking federal monies.
Dr. Warren, can I stay on and ask you a
Good
question?
night.
Sure. See everybody else.